So I'd like to introduce first him, and then we can move for his slides and presentation. Uh, Dr. Hughes has an executive director from of the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies, a very famous and one of the first site based and promote the transhumanism and the longevity context. He's a bioethicist and socialist at Trinity College of Connecticut, where he teaches healthy policy and serves as a director of institutional research and planning. He holds a doctorate degree in sociology from University of Chicago, where he taught bioethics at the McLean Center of Clinical Medical Ethics. He is the author of Citizen Cyborg and also working on a second book titled Cyborg Buddha. Since 1999, he has produced several radio programs at Chen Surfer Radio. He is also the fellow of World Academy of Art and Sciences and a member of Humanity Plus, the Neuroethics Society, the American Society of Bioethics, and the Working Group on the Ethics and Technology at Yale University. He speaks on medical ethics, health care policy, and future studies worldwide. So we are very heartily welcome Mr. Hughes on this conference organized by India Future Society. Please present your work, and you are on. Go on.
Great. Thanks, thanks so much. I just wanted to say that this work that we're doing now on technological unemployment has been a new and very welcome shift for us from some of the more transhumanist topics that we've addressed in the past. We just spent last year working on the topic of non-human personhood rights and did a conference at Yale on that. We're focusing this year on this topic of technology unemployment and the basic income guarantee. And one of the reasons that we're focusing on that is that we think that too many futurists and certainly people in the transhumanist community jump to, well, they either assume that technology will always create jobs in the future, or they jump to a future utopia in which radical abundance will give free stuff to everybody, and we don't have to worry about unemployment because everyone will have superabundance. So I want to work through the scenario here a little bit and talk about what the policy options need to be. The term technological unemployment was coined by John Maynard Keynes. In this quote, he talked about a future in which technology destroyed more jobs than it created. And of course, this expectation of technological unemployment goes back at least 200 years. We find writers in the Enlightenment, the French and British Enlightenment, beginning to speculate about a future in which people were freed from labor. Condorcet, famously in his works on progress, speculated that eventually human beings would not have to work. Of course, the assumption was that we would have universal abundance in many of those utopian thinkers. So in the 20th century, when we had the Great Depression, Keynes began to think, and others began to think more seriously about the fact that we might end up without universal abundance. Let's see. So one of the things that many of these slides, of course, are going to reflect statistics about the American labor situation. This one reflects the decline of agricultural labor on the part of men over the course of the last 150 years, and the corresponding increase in some other occupations, some white-collar occupations. But the greatest change in the American labor situation has been the entrance of women into paid labor. Of course, women have always worked in one way or another, but they entered after World War II very strongly into the paid labor market. And as a consequence, we saw from World War II to the present an increase in the proportion of the population that was in paid labor. That began to decline in 2000, as I'll show in a second. But I wanted to address this. One of the reasons why people have assumed, economists in particular, have assumed and have as a very strong dogma the notion that technology will always create employment. And these were outlined by some Italian economists about 10 years ago, these kind of points of dogma. So the first is the dogma that new machines will always create new occupations that human beings will be able to fill. So that's the compensation via new machines and products. Compensation via decrease in prices is the notion that innovation reduces the cost of inputs and goods, stimulates greater demand, and creates more employment. In order to human beings will have to make the things that are have this increase in demand. So as, for instance, computers get cheaper, there should be more people making computers as more and more people buy them. Compensation via new investments, that's the notion that the profits created by greater productivity will go to the owning class, and they will invest these profits to create more employment. Compensation versus a decrease in wages. So these are the two policy parts of this, of the dogma. One is if you're a libertarian, you argue that there's a little bit of wind someplace. Is that me? Somebody should be muted. Okay, so compensation via decrease in wages is the libertarian projection that if actually unemployment begins to fall short, all we need to do is eliminate minimum wages, eliminate worker protections, and eventually the employment will pick up because people will be able to find jobs, although poorly paying jobs. Compensation via increase in wages is the Keynesian projection that all we need to do to create more employment is to redistribute the wealth that's being created by productivity and give people jobs. So these are the kind of components of why economists have this dogma that employment will always be created by technology. So one of the first things to observe here is that in the industrialized world, there's been a steady decline in the proportion of work lives that a worker spends in work. Now, as I said, women have always worked in one way or another. You could say that a woman's work was probably never done, but once they entered into the paid labor force, they began to participate in this same dynamic that there was a decline in the work week, a decline in the number of hours spent, of course, across the work life in paid labor. And this decline has continued up to the present and continues through the present throughout the OECD, throughout the industrialized world. But also the proportion of the population that is in paid labor in the industrialized world has begun to decline over the last 10 years. In most of the OECD, it saw a sharp decline in 2008 to the present. A small percent of overall, but as you see here with the proportion in the United States, we reached a peak of the population in paid employment around 2000, and it's been declining since then. Now, there are several reasons for this decline. One is the baby boom reaching a retirement age, and so some of them are beginning to retire, which will be the second part of my observation. But part of it is also the jobless recovery that we've been experiencing, and that is partly having to do with this steady increase in productivity. Now, another dynamic with the steady increase in productivity over the last 200 years, but especially the last 50 years, has been that in the United States, the compensation rate has been flat since about the 1970s, the inflation-adjusted compensation rate. So there's been steady productivity increases, but the profits that have been produced have not been reinvested in creating more jobs, at least in the last 10 years. And they're certainly not being reinvested in increasing the abundance of the average worker. This is another way of looking at that same dynamic, which is the proportion of the total economy in the United States that goes to corporate profits versus to employee compensation. And you can see that over the last 40 years, the proportion going to employment compensation has been declining, and the proportion of wealth going to corporate profits, and of course to the top 1% of income earners, has been increasing. Now, to turn to the automation part of this, I don't think I have to give a hard sell to this audience for the argument that I don't think I have to give a hard sell to this audience that the different kinds of technologies can have the potential to displace human labor. My argument is that all jobs are potentially automatable and done cheaper by done cheaper and better by machines than by human workers. But I think there are some aspects of this that might be illuminating. One is this recent paper from Oxford, The Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization? A very interesting analysis that looked at the components of different kinds of jobs and the ways that the kinds of skills the jobs required, and then classified several hundred jobs throughout industrialized economies about how automatable they would be. And you see here their projection that recreational therapists, so people who work with people around physical therapy or recreational therapy, that kind of a job would not be terribly automatable. Their assumption is that dentistry couldn't be automatable. But at the other end, things like technical writing, retail sales assistants, accountants, and telemarketers, they think will be highly automatable within the next 20 years. And their projection in this paper is that 50% of all jobs in the United States are subject to automation within the next 20 years. Now, there's another dynamic, and it's not just automation and artificial intelligence and robotics, but it's also the disintermediation that's created by the internet. So basically, the connection between the supplier and the buyer of any particular service or good, when the internet or automation makes that unnecessary, then all the jobs in between become subject to being redundant. And we see this, for instance, with Netflix having destroyed the video, the market for video stores. We used to have, a thriving business of renting videos, and that doesn't exist anymore. Amazon is having that kind of an impact on bookstores. Expedia and other kinds of travel agents have had that effect on on travel agents. So disintermediation is also part of the story of technological unemployment. Now, some of the economists who agree that there is technological unemployment, their argument is that the impact has not been overall the destruction of jobs. They're still optimistic that there will be creation of certain kinds of jobs in the future. But they do acknowledge that the kinds of jobs that have been destroyed have tended to be middle-class jobs. And so jobs at the lower wage part of the spectrum that have been preserved are things that, that require physical dexterity that robots can't do, or require certain kinds of service labor that robots can't do, but they pay the minimum wage in the United States. Versus at the other end of the spectrum, very high cognitive demand jobs that pay very well. So this has created a bimodal effect on employment and income, so that it's destroying the middle class, but creating more of a two-tiered society in the United States. And of course, as I mentioned before, most of the wealth that's been created by our economy over the last 20 years has been going to the top 1%, and that accumulation of wealth at the top of our society has been increasing in its accelerating in an increasing rate over the last decade. Now, some people have argued, and Frey and his colleague argue at Oxford, that there are certain kinds of occupations that are immune to this kind of automation, and those are the occupations that require human creativity or certain kinds of unautomatable skills. And they point to things like healthcare and education. But there are many trends in healthcare and education that would argue contrary to their projection that there are certain kinds of jobs that are safe. We already see telepresence and robotic assistance happening in the healthcare sector. We see telemedicine potentially displacing the need for certain kinds of physicians. We see the de-skilling of labor because nurses can now do many of the things that physicians used to be required to do with the right kind of assistance. We see clinical decision support systems. So physicians are subject to all the foibles of human reasoning, and their capacity to make clinical decisions and diagnostic decisions is subject to their education and background. But once you automate the process of clinical decision making, you can have the wisdom of thousands of physicians in real time updating the clinical protocols and do a better job of doing medicine, essentially, than physicians themselves. And so the need for a physician becomes redundant, and you can have a nurse instead. We see the need for hospitals declining because of the growth of wearable patient monitoring systems and home medical systems that can take urinalysis and blood analysis and detect when someone has a fall and monitor their compliance with taking drugs. We see the same dynamic, of course, in higher education in general, with distance and online learning, although the evidence so far for the efficacy of online and distance learning is still pretty weak. But I think that as we improve the bandwidth and the modalities, that we will, in the next decade or two, have some pretty effective online distance learning methods of doing pedagogy. And this has the potential to eliminate large swaths of teachers, including college professors. Now, another part of the technological unemployment spectrum that people have not yet quite grokked or addressed is the impacts potentially of 3D printing and desktop manufacturing. If we get to the point where there are, and by the way, China is recently investing in the creation of a 3D printing facility that will print entire automobiles. So we're at the point already where there's a technology to have a design in CAD/CAM, ship it across the world to a 3D printer, and print something as large as an automobile. But most of the experimentation so far is in materials like plastic and with desktop manufacturing and things like that. So it's not quite threatening anybody's industries yet. But if we get to the point where we have a local store that has a 3D printer that can print large consumer objects, then a lot of the jobs between design and sale will be threatened. The manufacturing jobs, the transportation jobs, and the kind of retail jobs that would otherwise have been there. Another thing that, of course, many of the economists don't take into account is the impact of technological acceleration. Again, with you guys, I don't think I have to make the case, but they often make linear assumptions about the impacts of technology when nonlinear assumptions are more appropriate. The impacts, for instance, of artificial intelligence and of automation may be quite nonlinear within the next 10, 20 years. I just give a couple more examples here. Some of the jobs that people think are immune. Robot prostitution is probably going to be attractive, at least for some. And so one of the oldest professions may be subject to automation. There's been evidence for 50 years in the United States since the creation of the ELIZA program that artificial intelligence may do a better job of counseling people than actual human psychologists would. And here I give an example of an online computerized confessional. So maybe even priests will be subject to automation. In the United States, college graduates had long been assumed one of the ways to avoid unemployment was to become a college graduate, but college graduates in the last couple of years since the economic crisis have also been subject to some of these trends of technological displacement. We've seen a sharp increase in part-time work, so trying to assess whether we're actually being subject to technological unemployment, part of it is the total number of work hours that the population on average has to work, the proportion of the population that's in paid labor, but also the increasing precariousness of the paid labor that people are in. There's been an increase in part-time work sharp increase in the last 5-6 years in the United States, and an increase in the number of jobs that people will hold over the course of their lifetime as their work becomes increasingly fractured. Now, the other piece of the equation, and I don't want to go over my time too much here, but the other piece of the equation is that we're going to be living longer, and this in the industrialized world. Now, India doesn't have to worry about this quite so much because it's a very young population, and so you won't be experiencing the effect of old age dependency ratio until your current population reaches, 65, 70 or whatever, which is a ways off. But China will get there a lot quicker because of the one-child policy, and throughout the industrialized world, especially in places like Italy, which has very low birth rate, where they're going to be experiencing very sharp old age dependency ratio problem within the next decade or two. Now, there's been an increase in the United States of older people trying to stay in the workforce, especially white-collar workers, service employee workers. People who have been in physical labor, it's much harder for them to stay in the workforce in their senior years. But there's been an increase in older people trying to not retire and to stay in the workforce. Recently, Gallup surveyed Americans, what age did you retire, and that age has been increasing. This is the old age dependency ratio throughout the world, and as I said, India and of course Africa will have less of this problem within the next, this is projected for 2030, what the rates of old age dependency ratio are going to be. Western Europe having the most acute problem. We have a relatively less problem in the United States because we have a lot of immigration of relatively young people from places like Mexico, and also a relatively high birth rate compared to Western Europe. But we will also experience this problem acutely. Let's see, I'm going to skip. Okay, so the longevity dividend, this has been something that we've been working on at the IET for a long time, the notion that, that it's not necessarily bad to have an older population if we can come up with technologies that will keep people healthier longer and allow them to not become a burden on the public welfare system through their need for nursing care and expensive medical care. Now, the flip side of that is trying to get them back into the labor market. As I said, many older workers in the United States are trying to stay in the labor market, but if there's technological unemployment and an increasing healthy old population that is trying to stay in the labor market because of this problem of old age dependency, then we're going to have a convergence of these two problems. That there's the labor market, the potential jobs that people could get will be shrinking, and the number of people wanting to get those jobs will be growing. So what are some of the policy responses that will be projected, have already been discussed by people? Well, there's not very many that we have to go through, but it's basically we could protect jobs from technology, we could redistribute the jobs that continue to exist, we could create new jobs through public funding, we could enhance human workers to stay ahead of the robots, we could hope for magic nanoboxes to make free stuff for everybody, or we can figure out a way to pay everybody even though they don't have a job. Those are the basic options, and I'm just going to go through them very quickly. Protecting unemployment, there's a great example in the United States. New Jersey has a ban on self-serve gasoline so that they protected the jobs of people who pump gasoline. And it makes it unattractive for me when I drive through New Jersey to actually get my gasoline filled, because it takes about twice as long to have to use a human service worker than to just jump out of my car and fill my own tank. The costs of those kinds of Luddite bans eventually accumulate and become greater than the benefits. And so I think in the long run, the political attractiveness of these kinds of bans, even if there's a widespread acknowledgement of technological unemployment, there's going to be very little political pull for policies that say we should all be a little bit poorer and have a little bit poor quality service from the services and the industries that we're part of, so that human beings can stay in paid labor. I don't think that's going to be a very popular policy. Examples from history include the Ming Dynasty having destroyed their own sea power by closing themselves off to the world, and the Tokugawa isolation period in Japan. And eventually, another problem that addresses countries that decide to pursue a Luddite policies is that the rest of the world does not pursue those Luddite policies, and you become quite vulnerable geopolitically. You have reduced international competitiveness. So any country that decides, well, we're just going to pursue Luddite policies to protect employment will become quite vulnerable on the world stage. It's possible, however, to have, this is an example of the current robot density within Europe and the industrialized world. And Japan and Germany have high robot densities, and they have become, they're still relatively egalitarian countries. And so these have been to the benefit. Of course, Europe now has a lot of employment difficulties, which may be, again, partly to the result of technological employment. Now, redistributing employment with job sharing, of course, is one of the things that will be pursued, and I think it will be a popular policy. Americans work too many hours already compared to Europeans who have much more vacation time, and so I think throughout the industrialized world, there's going to be a call for shorter work life, a shorter work week, more vacations, and so forth. And a call to lower the mandatory retirement ages to get more older people out of the labor force so that there will be more jobs for younger people. Of course, that will, as I said, come into conflict with the increasing longevity of older people. There will be demands for creating employment, but the public sectors in the industrialized world have been flat or shrinking in the period of the last 6 years because of the austerity measures that have been pursued, as opposed to previous periods of recession, which saw Keynesian investments to increase employment in the public sectors. And so we've seen a decline in the size of the public sector throughout the OECD, throughout the industrialized world, in the last 6, 7 years. And we've also seen the U.S. military has just announced that it wants to return military size, the size of our armies, to pre-World War II levels, partly because of the increased investment in robotic drones and other kinds of high technology, which we hope to maintain U.S. military superiority with, even with fewer soldiers. And this is true in Europe as well. European armies have also been shrinking. Of course, China has not been shrinking their army, they've been increasing their army. So there are some countries around the world that have not been shrinking their armies. But these two kinds of public sector employment, post offices in the United States, the size of postal labor force has been shrinking. All kinds of public sector employment, from postal workers to the military, are probably not going to be able to absorb technological unemployment. Now, we could enhance human workers to try to stay ahead of the robots, and I won't give you the hard sell that I think that that is a good idea to enhance human workers, and it may help a little bit, but then in the long run, we probably cannot stay one step ahead of robotics and artificial intelligence. And I guess I've already given you indicated my opinion about these post-scarcity proposals. I hope that there's post-scarcity. I hope that there are magic nano boxes. I hope that there's widespread stock ownership and a post-singularity stock market so that everybody benefits from, billion-dollar Dows. But I just don't think that these kind of scenarios are terribly realistic. As one of the previous speakers said, we should probably stay a little bit closer to reality in our futurism. And they also require a political strategy. Okay, say we want to have everybody benefit from a post-singularity stock market and stock ownership. How do we get those stocks in everybody's hands? People don't have universal stock ownership right now. So I think it's a good idea, but we need to have a political strategy. Part of that political strategy has always been, since 200 years ago, when Condorcet and others began thinking about these things, they said, well, if we get to a point where we don't have to work anymore, we can create a society in which we all have a share in that society, where we all own the land at first, people who proposed universal redistribution of land ownership throughout the Enlightenment period, and more recently have been talking about a basic income guarantee, providing every citizen with a income from the redistribution of wealth in society. This would have the effect of divorcing income from work, expanding all of our social wages, free health care, and it would have the effect of replacing unemployment insurance, replacing old age security insurance, replacing disability insurance, and just giving everyone an income. And this proposal became very popular in the United States in the 1960s. We almost had the adoption of a negative income tax in the 1960s. And this was popular both by conservatives and liberals, people on the left, because the conservatives see this as a way, again, to shrink the state. So when we talk about the technological unemployment happening in the state, one of the ways to shrink the state is to get rid of all the welfare bureaucracy and just say, we're just going to send checks to everybody. With a negative income tax, there would be an inflection point of income. Everyone below that would get an increasingly large check. Everyone above that would have a progressive income tax. That would be one of the proposals for how to do this. Now, my final slide is just that I've recently written a paper and we'll be publishing a set of 9 papers on technological unemployment and the basic income guarantee in the Journal of Evolution and Technology. That will happen by Monday. And my paper talks about the need to think more seriously about the fiscal constraints that states are going to be under in this scenario. If there's declining employment, declining proportion of the population in paid employment, and an increasing accumulation of wealth at the corporate and top 1% of the population, then there has to be some reappropriation of wealth. We can start with public sector ownership of things like resources. And one of the examples of a citizen's dividend in the United States is that every Alaskan citizen owns a share, basically, in the oil that Alaska pumps to the United States. And so they get a check, about $5,000 a year. Every Alaskan citizen gets a check that's their share of the dividends off of those oil proceeds. Of course, around the world, public ownership of oil has not worked out terribly well. Most of that wealth gets pumped to Swiss banks instead of to people's pockets. But to the extent that we can have public ownership of these kinds of resources in the future, that may be one of the sources for paying these citizens' dividends. But eventually, we also have to have public ownership of the major sources of wealth, which are going to be some of the industries that are going to be highly roboticized. So that's a different argument for a different day about how what kind of a strategy, political strategy, allows us to eventually accumulate that wealth in public hands. But if you want to talk to me more about these things, you can always email me at director@iet.org. The slides, I think we sent the link, but I can send you the link as well. The slides are at iet.org archive. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope I didn't go over my time too much. I can't see my clock.
Thank you, Dr. James. Your lecture is really nice. And so, anyone want to ask anything?
I have a question. Can I?
Yeah. Go on.
Thank you, James. It was very interesting. Some of the trends that you described may indeed lead to the end of jobs, to the end to massive unemployment, but that would be an industrial unemployment. Do you foresee some kind of return to natural economy? People growing, maybe designing their own food, making or designing their own clothes, and so forth.
That's fascinating. Andre Gortz is one of the people who I mentioned in the talk and who was very influential in my own thinking about this. He was a French labor theorist, and one of his proposals was that to make the transition from the current industrial society to the post-industrial, post-work society, that there should be public investment in creating workshops where people can relearn the kind of joys of making their own things and you know, gardening and all the things that you mentioned. I think that that's an interesting proposal. We already see, of course, that there's a thriving hobby industry. I mean, I have a community, I have a local garden in my backyard that I don't need to, for food, but I do it for fun. And I think that many people will be attracted to that. One of the papers that we're publishing in the JET collection on Monday is by a Polish economist who argues that the state will be so fiscally constrained by the decline of income tax that people will have to turn to these kinds of non-monetary, these peer-to-peer forms of exchange, and that there'll be a growth of local currencies, there'll be a growth of people, the Airbnb, the people, couch surfing, and all these kinds of non-monetary forms of exchange, because there will be less money. People will have less money because they'll have less jobs. The state won't be able to give them money because it won't have the income tax, and so forth. That's a kind of utopian version of how we might get to universal non-monetary economy without the radical abundance part. So I think that is one of the scenarios that has to be considered, is that we may have an expansion of the non-monetary part of the economy.
Anyone else? I have a question, James, that do you think there's any possible alternate of a current economy of, you can say, current alternate of money that we earn due to employment or something similar way? Means if there's a possibility in transhumanism era that we can have something else in term of money. Means we do not want to go for money or we have now. We are looking for some alternates. What do you say? What will you say on this?
Well, Douglas Rushkoff is one of the IET fellows, and he has written a book, now probably 3 books ago. For him, he's very prolific. But he wrote a book about the history of currency, of money, and his argument is that the larger currencies have gotten, the more people become disempowered and the more dislocating economic effects they have. Now, I'm a world federalist, and I've always been in favor of one world currency. So I found his argument very disappointing, because I have believed politically that it would be a great idea for people to be united, around the world in one government, one currency, and so forth.
Yeah.
But his argument is that we need the growth of local currencies because they support economies and they support human needs better than global currencies do. And so perhaps in the future we'll have both. We'll have global currency as well as local currencies. Now, I think beyond that, beyond the creation of local currency and reputation, there may be the possibility for things like reputation economies. And if you've ever seen Cory Doctorow's novel, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which is set in a future Disneyland 100 years from now, he projects an economy called Woofies, which is a reputation economy that's maintained by artificial intelligence, basically, and the kind of connections that everyone has to their brains. So basically, you have an account of what your reputation is in society. You can kind of see this already with what we call the like economy, with people getting likes on their Facebook posts and their Twitter posts and things like that.
Right.
But you can imagine that in this future economy, that if you do nice things for people, you get an increase in your reputation, and then you get to spend that when you want something in particular, and it gets debited from your reputation account. And if you're a really bad person, your reputation account crashes. So this would be both a method of maintaining a nice society as well as having some kind of economic exchange. And I think that those kinds of ideas are also interesting and possible.
Yep. Anyone has? Thank you for answer.
Mm-hmm.
We can.
Yeah,
we can.
James, I have a question, Siddharth.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. What is your view of balancing the employment in terms of increasing technology? Like Claude talked about the autards. If we are going ahead with the autards, we are going to shut cut the employment in terms of 1,000 of people. Example of a British telecom, nowadays they have started using Author as a CHR, as a interacting with the people. Like they have any issue, they are going on a website and browsing it and giving concern, and Author is giving back answer upfrontly. By this, we are shortcutting like customer sales representative, like call centers and all. So, what is your view on this?
So, of this kind of outsourcing of labor, what effect it has on technology unemployment?
He's talking about the chatbot, I think. Chatbot introduction in the industry in place of human, actual human. So that that
Ah,
that you that you are asking, Kus?
Exactly, I'm asking in terms of employment. Actually, if one time we are talking about the technology, and we are decreasing the employment in terms. It's a
yes.
huge, yeah. So, what is your view on that?
Well, I think it's more or less inevitable, and I think if we can figure out how to slow the process so that it becomes manageable for society, it's not a problem. But I think we've seen in the United States, for instance, with the relationship of the Indian call centers to employment in the United States, there's a lot of resentment when some of these innovations take place. But in the end, call center work is not something that most people want to do for their lives, for their whole lives, and there are other forms of labor they would rather do. So any job that becomes subject to displacement by the kinds of technologies that you're talking about, I think in the end, people would rather do something else. And so we have to just figure out how they can, transition to doing that something else with their life.
Thank
I don't
you.
know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
I think I'd like to share a little bit more, expand more on that. It's not so much also call centers. It could be customer-facing jobs where, for example, if you've got things like I've been talking about a digital surrogate, which in fact is an avatar in essence. And if customers could actually see an avatar at a bank or anywhere out there interacting with them, you could have, I think, in the meantime, one human manning literally 5 or 10 of them, depending on on workload, before some form of artificial intelligence takes over even the human operator. So I guess we probably have a gradual decrease in jobs for humans, but it is a warning sign, and it is something to look out for. That I think probably humans need to start learning how to code soon as a way to kind of ensure some kind of job protection for the foreseeable future until such time when an alternative comes into place.
Well, even coding, of course, is subject to some of these trends. It's hard to see any form, law you would think would be a preserve in which human beings would have to be doing the work. But a lot of law has in the past been the process of legal discovery. So you subpoena a bunch of documents from a corporation, and then you have to have lawyers go through them to figure out which ones need to be a part of the proceedings. And that could take months. Now you have artificial intelligence. You subpoena the electronic documents. You put artificial intelligence in place, and a lot of the legal discovery process has now been automated. There are electronic forms for doing a lot of legal work. So in the case of programming, I'm not as familiar with what's happening in terms of the automation, but I know that there are efforts to automate many of the processes that are involved in programming as well. So it's not as error-prone as human beings tend to be. So I have two children in college right now, and so having this perspective on the labor market is pretty depressing because I don't know what to tell them to pursue as occupations, or anyone to pursue as occupations that will be safe from automation. But my daughter wants to be an opera singer, although it may be automatable. I don't think people will pay that much to see robot opera singers. So
that's true.
I have a question.
Yes.
Doc, I understand what you're talking about when you talk about technology displacing jobs. what I was thinking is, and I understand why you said that, I mean, thus far, going by the slides you presented, what I am asking is that given the advancement, current advancement happening in the development of the brain-computer interface technology, where sensors pick up our brain signals, brain waves, interpret them, and we can instruct the computers or any technology, like Muse, for example, one of the first products that's coming out, and technology being built into as a function in wearable computing devices. The question I have on my mind is, if we factor in the brain-computer interface where just by thought we can do something or create something, or without opening our mouths or using our physical bodies, using the mind, we can create things that we would otherwise not be competent to, and advances in programming technology where they interpret our thoughts and convert a lot of things more intelligently. Would you think that would reverse the trend where rather than being displaced from jobs, we actually create more opportunities, commercial opportunities for ourselves, except for that perhaps it'd be more entrepreneurial or technopreneurial rather than being in a job. But do you think it will stop the displacement or reverse the displacement?
Well, as I said, I think that human enhancement is going to be inevitable and is desirable, and that part of that human enhancement future, I imagine, will be brain-computer interfaces, increasingly connected to our neurons and to the world. And to the extent that we get connected to artificial intelligence, we may be enabled to stay ahead of some of these trends, so that at least those of us in the world who have that advantage of being able to get that kind of connection. That's another part of the kind of digital divide dilemma that will face the world, is that if one doctor connected to artificial intelligence can do the work of 1,000 primary care doctors, or 1,000,000 nurses or whatever, that will be technological unemployment as well. So highly enhanced workers may be able to stay ahead of the curve, but they may also displace as many workers as artificial intelligence would otherwise. But at any rate, to the extent that we can achieve those kinds of enhancements, yes, I do think there will be certain kinds of opportunities, employment opportunities, that will keep people in employment.
I think, yeah, it was a really good session, lots of questions, very big.